So like that's probably the main view of why the dismissal would occur or why it wouldn't. And if it doesn't occur, then either the judge saw something that was ringing true to them that could have been malicious in some sort of way, and Richard Hart's lawyers were not presenting the data that was needed to suggest otherwise to the judge specifically, because the judge is the one that's going to make the call on these things, not a body of peers, right? Anyway, so buy the rumor, sell the news could be a situation why those people are coming in. So that's where I say that if the dismissal did happen, like it could be particularly parabolic, because then you'll see a lot more money that's coming in across the bridge. Right now, before I get speaking about it too much, since I've been kind of watching the bridge for the last couple of weeks now, that the bridged in to Pulsechain asset value was at about 109 million before this change in sentiment has happened in Pulsechain, and now it's at 117. So there's been $7-8-ish million that have came in the last couple of weeks, or last when this forex had happened in the last like 30 days. That's kind of significant when you look at the other side, bridged out assets to Ethereum. It's only increased by maybe a couple 100,000. It's only at 3 million. $3,092,000. That's it. That's a ratio that you've got to love. 117 million versus 3. And the 117 million is growing, while the 3 million is not really in comparison. It'll be interesting to see what these values, these ratios between each other will look like as we get closer to the October 31st date and after the October 31st date, depending on what the outcome is, which is something that I'll be looking at for sure to see what's happening. I mean, is it going to be a position where assets are coming in to correlate values together? What happens with it when it comes across? Is it added to liquidity? Where is it being added to? And or is it being bridged back out again to those other networks that they came from? Not something that I can prejudge ahead of time, obviously, but something that will be something to watch for sure, because I know liquidity is king on being able to understand what volatility is and where it starts and stops. But without this bridge, this Omni bridge that Pulsechain has, you'd still be ratio trading. There'd be no price values on anything if it wasn't for this bridge. So this $117 million coming in and that $3 million going out is the actual value of Pulsechain, which I hope that you guys understand what that means, right? Like if the bridged in assets were zero because the bridge had no assets on it, then there would be no correlated value to the other networks that everyone needs to go through, which is ETH. So that's also another thing that I'm watching, is how much ETH is coming across that bridge and how much of it's actually being utilized versus the stable tokens that are there, and how much of it is actually being used in the liquidity pools. The main DEX, it's pretty easy. You got a lot of DEXs that are on Pulsechain, but there's always one giant monster that's there, and that's Pulsex. So it actually becomes very easy to see where the volatility starts and stops and what assets actually have volatility or not, by just going to Pulsex, go to the farms, drop down the details menus underneath every single farm that's there, because these are the Richard Hart assets, right? They're the ones that have the majority of the liquidity. They're the ones that matter. They're almost every single other asset that is on Pulsechain. Actually, I would venture to say that every single asset that is on Pulsechain is in some way correlated to Pulsex, Inc., Hex, maybe even in a certain way. And whether they liked it or not, as soon as that they correlated it to Pulsechain, they were kind of in a way correlated to the rest of those as well. When you actually go open up those detail menus, it actually tells you like Inc. and Pulse has $39 million worth of liquidity attached to each other. Inc. and Pulsex has another $50 million worth of liquidity attached to each other. You could think of that as just Inc. in and of itself, with $90 million worth of liquidity that's tying Pulse and Pulsex together to Inc. in like a little triangle thing that it has, but that's $90 million on Inc. If you just go look at Pulsex on that main page, it only really has one other tied correlation, and that's to Pulsechain, where there's only $54 million tied to it. 54 million versus 90 means that the ratio versus Pulse itself with Pulsex is less volatile, higher volatility with Pulsex than with Inc, right? Inc's got $90 million between Pulsex and Pulse, but Pulsex itself only has 54 million tied to Pulsechain. So if people come in and they're buying Pulsechain, the one that's going to actually be more volatile to the upside would be Pulsex, not Inc. Inc has almost double the liquidity, meaning that it has less volatility to the upside. It will go up. It will change the ratio as people buy it. Like if people buy Pulsex, especially while people are buying Pulse, it'll overperform Pulsex even higher than it would with Inc. And in that same breakdown, Hex has its tie together on this DEX with Pulse also. Not Inc, not two different pools with Inc, but just one pool with Hex versus Pulse, and that's at $34 million. That's even less than what Pulsex has versus Pulse. And I already told you that with Pulsex, that Pulsex is going to have the higher price performance as people come in and buy. But since Hex has even lower, it's only got 34 million compared to 54 million, that it's going to be even more volatile than Pulsex, which Pulsex is more volatile than Inc, and therefore there is your rotation. Rotate into Hex. After Hex has its higher appreciation on volatility, you rotate out of that into either Pulsex or Inc in that respect, where it has more liquidity for when people come, when the top starts to happen on that local top and people start to sell. There's a lot more liquidity in Inc when people start selling. So that means that it'll actually perform better on the downside. It'll be smaller, greener candles on the correlation. Yes, everything else will show red candles, but Inc will have smaller red candles, just like Inc will have smaller green candles. So if you have a speculation that price appreciation is about to happen, then you want to rotate into the one that's going to have the higher volatility to the upside, which is Hex. And then when you see it starts to get toppy, you need to rotate back out again into the higher liquidity environment that's going to stunt the red candles when they actually happen, which is definitely Inc. And if you wanted to sit in the middle, then you'd go to Pulsex. Most people probably wouldn't see it like that. It's like a red light, a green light, and a yellow light, right? On where you would see those things happen. And let me remind you that I'm doing that analysis right now as I'm talking to you. I'm actually looking at Pulsex. I'm actually looking at the values, and I'm actually telling you what I see today, right now, with where the volatility starts and stops for each asset in the Richard Heart ecosystem. But by tomorrow, all of that shit could change. And it isn't because of the bridge. Like somebody can come across that's got $50 million in one of the assets and remove half of it, so it's only 25 million. Now that might change the game. That might change how I view things. Which one is now more volatile compared to the rest of them, right? That does mean that I have to go look at multiple pairs instead of just looking at one because of the correlation that they have between each other. And I know that might sound very confusing, right? It might. Some of you guys might actually get what I'm saying, because I'm not actually showing you. I'm not sharing my screen and showing you guys this stuff. I'm just talking verbally. And some people don't learn very well without a visual. And I get that. But there are... I'm not coming in here to promote myself, so I'm not even going to go there with that. But if you were interested in these types of things, these are the things that you need to look at, right? You need to see the bridge value, see whether it's volatile or not. Go look at gopulse.com, go look at the bridge, keep that page open, monitor it every day. How much has it changed? How much is coming in? How much is going out? Go open up Pulsex, open up those details. See, you can tell correlation because the assets are actually connected to each other. Like when you go scroll down to the bottom of the page and you want to see what Inc is correlated to in the biggest way of liquidity, then it shows you at the very bottom that one of those farms is an Inc Pulsex farm and an Inc Pulse farm. You take the values of the total liquidity together and add them together, and you'll see where the volatility starts to slow down for that particular asset. And then if you want to look at another asset, you can see that like Inc and Pulsex, Inc and Pulse are correlated together. And then you have Pulse on here as well that goes to Pulsex, DAI, USDC, USDT, Hex, and Ethereum. The only ones that make sense as far as correlating to the larger markets would be Ethereum, right? If you see a lot of Ethereum that's coming across the bridge and it actually starts getting stacked up, where you see that the current ETH Pulse pool is total liquidity of $20 million right now. But you start to see that actually go to from 20 million to 30 million to 40 million to 50 million, or even overnight it doubles. It just goes from 20 million to 40, or it starts to shine over the rest of the liquidity pools that are there. Let's say that you wanted to correlate Inc. to have very high price performance versus what ETH is doing, then you'd see that $20 million become $100 million over a certain period of time, overnight, over a couple of weeks. It depends on how many clips that the person's bringing over and starts adding those things in there, because they speculate that ETH is going to start going up in price, and they want to actually have price performance with Pulse, Hex, Inc, Pulsex, without actual volume coming across the pair to change the ratios. So as ETH starts to go up, then you see Pulsechain start to go up with it. I don't know if you guys have noticed this, but as Bitcoin and Ethereum has been in their bull market, that as they rise in price, that we over here in Pulsechain just kind of sit there and do nothing. And people are very confused, right? How come we're not having price appreciation, but everything else out in the market is doing that? Because the environment is not set up for that. Somebody who has the majority of the money does not want to be correlated to those markets regardless of what's happening. And until they see an advantage of doing that, then that's when you'll start to see that Ethereum coming across the bridge is being correlated to the rest of the Richard Heart ecosystem assets that are there. And that could be potentially bullish, right? But right now, what I see is a decorrelation of the market where the stable tokens, if you add all the stable tokens versus Pulse together, that they dominate anything else, decorrelating away from the rest of the markets. If Bitcoin was to take a shit right now, a little amount of $20 million worth of ETH that's there is only going to affect it by, let's say, 1/3, right? If there's $20 million in ETH, but then there's $75 million in stables that are correlated to Pulsechain, then they're going to work in a ratio of 1-3, or 1 to 4, I guess, because there's multiple, 1 to 4. So one has a correlated value of 25%, that as the Bitcoin takes a shit or Ethereum takes a shit, that it's only going to have 25% of the volatility that actually affects Pulsechain itself on its asset value. Whereas the decorrelated side is 75% in stables, where it always stays as well, for the most part, it stays at a ratio of 1 all the time, meaning that no matter what happens with ETH, it's going to continue to have that ratio of a 1 to 4 on the downside for volatility and the upside for volatility as well. And the upside, it goes both ways. So even if they do go up, it's only going to affect it by 1/4 of whatever the volatility was for Ethereum versus Pulsechain, meaning that if Ethereum goes up 100% right now, as far as what I see, that Pulsechain will only be rewarded with a 25% increase. That's it. But if you want a 100% increase, then you remove the majority of all those USDC all the stables, and then correlate it to ETH, where that ratio goes from a 1 to 4 to a 1 to 1. Then if Ethereum goes up 100% and there was no volume coming in, nobody was buying Pulsechain, let's just say, then the ratios will change by the same value, or roughly around the same value, because Ethereum's going to have buyers, sellers, and stuff that are happening as well, right? But the overperformance of Pulse would be to do that and then have people actually buying Pulsechain. They're not buying ETH, they're buying Pulsechain while the ratio is changing, because ETH is changing. It would show an overperformance. So while ETH goes up by 100%, and then Pulsechain inevitably goes up by 100% because it's correlated directly to ETH, if people are buying Pulsechain, then it goes up higher than 100%, showing that it's overperforming ETH because people actually have interest in buying Pulsechain. And that's just the way that it works. But you can't do this analysis a month ago off of what's currently there and then make it true and congruent to what's happening today. You have to do this analysis every day that you find interest in it, because those total liquidity values can change overnight. You go to bed, it's 50 million. You wake up, it's 25. Why is it 25? Where did it go? Was it bridged across the bridge? Is that even affecting the value of Pulsechain right now or not? Those are all things that you'd actually have to take into consideration and then put into your spectrum of data sets that you're collecting to know what those ratios are and how they can be affected by dollar values coming in. Then you can actually collect the data to be able to make an informed decision. And that takes years, potentially, unless whatever I just said right there, what was jiving with you in such a way that all of a sudden the light bulb just went off with you. Congratulations, you're like ahead of 90% of the rest of crypto that's out there that doesn't understand what I just said. I just spoke a bunch of Chinese to all of you. But if you did understand what I just said, then you pretty much got the keys to the castle. what I just did. What I just told you was the way to be able to see what would be the best assets to get into now and which would be the best ones to rotate out of later, and vice versa, because it goes both ways. If you think that the market is going to be taking a dump, then, and you don't want to go get into USDC, which would probably be the best case scenario, is go get into stables, right? But let's say that it was an asset that has utility to it. By, you know, you getting into it, you can go put it into a farm or some shit like this, right? And that farm was going to mitigate some of the risk that you were taking on the downside. Then you're going to want to go get into the highest liquidity one, because it's going to be less affected by the downturn, less affected by the upturn as well. But that's not the one that you want to rotate into for the upturns. You want to rotate into the one that has the least amount of liquidity, has the most volatility. So that way you can capture those gains. With your $1,000, it ain't going to affect a $34 million pool. But with your $1,000, you could Forex it, and then you could rotate out of it into the higher liquidity, lower volatile areas. So that way, if it does start to turn and start to go down after a rise in price, that you're protected. You are actually mitigating some of that risk without actually having to. Some countries, if you go into a stable token, you are creating a tax burden on yourself. So going from one asset to another that isn't a stable token sometimes is what people would want to do. So I can understand why I would have to, think about going asset to asset in the exotic side versus asset to stable, and why people would maybe not want to do that, right? Some people may not even rotate at all because of their tax burden that they already had from the year, that they want to show a congruent loss. So that way they can actually report that and actually get some money back at the end of the year. Those things, it all depends on the individual with that. That's something that I could not. That's way too personal of information for me to be able to add to my data set of thought process. But I have heard a lot of going on about rotation lately. So I figured that's something that I should talk about, right? Icosa. Hedron in the interim is already a part of that, right? But as you can see, that icosa specifically has a lot of volatility. It's almost like it is trying, even on the sells, sometimes you notice that the price appreciates, right? If the price was 15 cents and somebody comes in and sells $1,000, it goes up to 16 cents. Well, why would that have happened? So the market maker itself, like on Deck Screener, is going to actually show you that sell actually increased the price. That's some shit that icosa does. Crazy. Pretty cool to see. I think that those things are always going to happen, just the way that icosa kind of operates in and of itself, kind of linked to its value with Hex in a significant way, especially with Hedron. Its mintability is based off of the same code with those assets specifically, and also promotes the availability for people to get an understanding of what Hex is, and also maybe purchase some of that as well, which is also going to change the ratio, which is also going to increase the price of icosa and Hedron. Those of you that are already in icosa, that already know these things, that have already talked about these things in a significant type of way, as time progresses and moves on, you guys are probably becoming more and more believers of that understanding of the volatility of what icosa can do. And that's probably the reason why a lot of us are still here. Because if you're a Richard Hart believer, then you're definitely an Alex believer in being able to have multiple speculative assets that you can get into with high volatility, low volatility, and those types of rotational movements that you would see, where because ink went up, now you're able to get more Hex. Because you're able to get more Hex, you're able to get more involved with the staking side of it. Therefore, you're going to get more Hedron. It's going to build an emotional value to you. A lot of people, as we were speaking earlier, a lot of people that even when they have a plan, that when emotional things happen to you, you end up doing stuff that you never expected. That's how the majority of people work. That's the way that it's always going to be. And then after that emotional connection happens, it's like something that you're more willing to defend, not even in public, but just something that you defend in your own mind, right? Generally, the people that come across that type of stuff are long-term investors. They're not short-term minded. They're not general degens when it comes to these types of assets. Now, you might be a degen, but you know that these are probably not the assets that you want to kind of do those things with. But these are ones you want to rotate into and around within the structure of it. So that way you can garner more assets over a period of time. So that way, if there is some price appreciation, that you have multiple pools to be able to extract value if that's what you wanted, or to be able to inject value if you wanted. It's a very good environment for that. It's not necessarily a trader's asset. If you're a 30-day minded type of person, you're going to get wrecked. You are going to get destroyed, because there's going to be assets that if you're only in it for 30 days and you come in and you buy a top, within that 30 days, you're probably going to lose value, and you're going to say, this stuff is garbage. Why did I get involved in this? Because this is not an asset that takes 30 days to proceed with something that has good value to it. If people come in and they're buying the highest liquidity, lowest volatile pair, which is Pulse, and increases Pulse by 20%, then why the is Hex overperforming it? Because the ratio, because of the lower liquidity environment. Pulse, that the increase of price is going to be 0.00001, let's say, 4 zeros and a 1. But if I go spend $1 on Hex, the price increase is 3 zeros and a 1. That's obviously 10 times more efficient. So as people are buying Pulsechain, and it just changes the ratio between Hex and Pulse onto the upside, then anybody who comes and buys Hex during that period of time, while other people are buying Pulsechain, it's going to overperform Hex over anything that it's correlated to. And the same thing would happen with any other assets. If it was the same environment, same setup, same correlation, this is just actually all on one page where you can see it right on Pulsex where those things are at, which I don't even know if I should be telling you guys this shit, honestly. Late now. I already let the cat out of the bag. These are the types of things that I've been talking about for years in these chats, but we just never actually had a network at that time, right? I was talking about Ethereum and Hex, and that was pretty much it, because there was just two pools to look at, the Hex ETH pool and the Hex USDC pool. And that was a lot easier back then, but still confusing for people. Still confusing for people to understand exactly what I was saying. And now you can actually see exactly what I'm saying. And before Pulsechain, this was true. And after Pulsechain, what I'm telling you guys right now is true, 100% true. And if there's more of you guys out there that are picking up what I'm throwing down, and your light bulbs are actually going off individually on your own behalf, you'd be able to make better decisions, better moves, be able to increase the value of the assets that you have over a certain period of time way easier than speculative bullshit. Just listening to other people manipulate you into doing this, that, or the other is not smart at all. Generally, if I come and tell you guys to go buy something specifically, generally I've already bought it. Then I come out and tell you to do that. With these things, you guys already know that I already have Hex, I already have Pulse, I already have Pulsex. It's no surprise to you guys when I come here and just tell you the values of what's volatile and what's not, because it doesn't matter, right? I'm not going and telling you guys to go buy degen coin, whatever. That might actually be a coin, so I better not say that. But a degenerative coin that was just doesn't even have 6 months of price performance on it or something like that, right? But if in that 6 months or even right away, it had values in the millions of dollars that were locked into liquidity that was paired to Pulsechain itself, then it would be a pertinent conversation to have at that point in time, whatever that asset was, right? That's sitting there with millions of dollars in liquidity tied to Hex, just specifically Hex, or tied to just specifically Pulsechain or Pulsex or Inc. And maybe not even spread across 5 different pairs to connect them together, but just connected to one of them. There could be intent behind that. And that would be what I would see the intent would be the exact understanding and the explanation that I just gave in like the last 30 minutes, right? It all depends on your volume. If you got $10,000 worth of volume every day, that's great for a pool that has millions of dollars that are in it. If you got a pool that's got millions of dollars in it, but there's millions of dollars of volume that's coming through it, then that's a whole different game where market makers are going to get more involved. They're going to start buying the asset, supporting the asset. Same thing that's what's going on with Hex, Pulsex, and Inc. Other assets can do that, but they're going to have to correlate to the correct ones and know to decorrelate at the same times that those assets do the same thing, which means you're probably going to have stable pairs, which is something that we don't see. Other assets don't generally have stabilized pairs to die. There are a couple that are out there. I'm not going to make mention of them because we're in the icosa chat. But there are ones that are out there that are starting to understand those types of things. That there are maybe certain times where you need to reduce the amount of the asset that you have compared to an exotic pair like Pulse, and need to increase the DAI, so that way you're not correlated to Pulsechain itself. Just the same thing like what I would say what Pulsechain would do on its correlation with ETH. Why you would see ETH coming across the bridge to try to garner some of that price appreciation from ETH just moving in price to the upside, and then us getting that price appreciation because the ratio changed. Would be the same thing that these other things would do, but it's not with ETH. It would be directly with Pulsechain. Pulsechain being the ETH of this network. Same thought process, just different assets. But it still operates the same no matter what you do in high liquidity, low liquidity environments. Based off of these pairs. How does he want these things to move? Does he want you to get into Pulse, or does he want you to get into Hex? It would suggest to me today that with the volatility and the liquidity that's there, that you'd want to get into Hex. You obviously, if you're outside of the network, you're going to have to buy Pulse, which as people come across the bridge and they get Pulse to buy Hex, or they bring in their ETH to buy Hex, then that's a totally different. We can go look at the ETH Hex pool itself and see how much liquidity is there. But I think we'd all agree that there's more liquidity in Pulse Hex and Pulse ETH, that it would make more sense that the aggregators themselves that you use, or you yourself in a manual trade, will see in that manual trade that you have higher slippage going straight from ETH to Hex. So you kind of have to go buy some Pulse. And when you go buy the Pulse, considering that Hex and Pulse are correlated, that you're going to change the ratio on your way in as well. So not only do you have to make two buys or go to an aggregator that's going to do it for you in a multi-trade, it's going to do it through Pulse, period, which is going to increase the ratio, which is going to increase the price performance, which, as you can tell with the lower volatility of Hex, it's going to have a higher price performance, meaning that you should have got into it a long time ago. And that's the same case with every asset that you're ever going to come across that actually has some value and appreciation that's happening to it. You're going to have that happen in your psychological mindset that you should have done this earlier. You should have been paying attention, but you're not going to understand why unless you got a guy like me that's telling you exactly the reasons why these things are happening. Why did that price perform the way that it did? Right? And you don't even need me. If you're listening and I just told you what I actually look at to garner myself the availability of understanding, I mean, as far as what I was just told recently today, that Morales Money does a good job of kind of cutting out me as a guy that would be able to interpret these types of things for you. What data that actually pulls in to be able to give you that is probably 100% based off of those liquidity values and the availability for volatility to be there, right? So it's going to have indicators that would show you exactly what I'm already telling you. I'm not involved in Morales Money. I've been talking about these things before Morales Money was even a thing. But I do like to see that there's tools that are coming out there that make my job a little bit easier to try to wrap people's heads around exactly what's happening in these ecosystems, especially this one. Like the Richard Hart ecosystem is the most important, because if it fails, which I don't, there's zero speculation in my mind that suggests that, but let's just say in worst case scenario that it fails, so does everything else in Pulsechain. So does everything else. And there's been a lot of FUD, a lot of speculation for the last 15 years as to the reasons why cryptocurrency should fail, because people just don't understand it. It just doesn't make any sense to them. And that narrative has never rung true. As a matter of fact, it was the worst speculative thought process that anyone could have had. So this is a little bit different in the fact that you have a little bit more freedom to be able to have creativity with your network outside of what was already copied from Ethereum. You can pick and choose what you want to have, as opposed to a layer 2 that's going to have to kind of ride with the validators doing exactly what the rest of the Ethereum network decides that it's going to do as a layer 2. Otherwise, it won't be able to have such cheap transactions, right? Which the future roadmap of Ethereum would suggest that they're working on this sharding thing as much as they possibly can. It's a little bit more than just a speculative thought, an idea, that they're actually getting it coded, and there may be potential for other things to further that to actually happening, as opposed to just, daydreaming about it, which in my opinion is pretty good, right? You want less daydreaming and more actual something you can validate as a factual thing, that actually is going to make sense with why the network is going to actually be cheaper. But I mean, unfortunately for almost all networks, this is a fallacy of networks, is the cost to operate it in transactional fees will increase all the time. Even Pulsechain over a certain period of time is going to do the same thing that Ethereum is currently doing now if we don't have some sort of sharding type of technology that breaks down the availability of transactions to happen at a cheap way.
Liquidity pools, you're like, it's broken. Well, they have a white list, right? So everything is not tracked the way you would think it's supposed to be tracked. So that's number one. So Pulsex has a whitelist. What does that mean? They primarily are interested in Pulse, Pulsex, Inc., Hex, eHex, and the E stables. Some other things make it through their gate, but you'll go look and there's no liquidity. It'll appear as liquidity, but it's got no volume, right? Because it's been relegated to untracked volume. And then to compound that, depending on where you go to look at this on charts, you will see that the charts look funky. You have no prices, or it says it can't determine liquidity, yada, yada, right? So you have that. So first off, understand that Pulsex is software. Somebody makes decisions, and sometimes when they write a front end, there could be a mistake, right? All right, so that's first off. Second, dexes themselves, other dexes. Well, every dex does not have aggregation built in, right? So every dex does not look at every other dex. Sometimes they only care about their own stuff. So again, be careful, because you see something you don't think is right, stop. Use the STAR process, stop, think, act, review, and whatever order where it makes sense for you. Because if you're getting a 50% slippage, you probably need to stop and go look and see.
You can just go into Dex Screener, type in Hex, and it'll pull up the highest liquidity positions that are there, so you can actually go see it. Click on that one that has the highest liquidity in it, and then up on the top right of that screen, it'll tell you what DEX that it's in. So if it says that it's if it says that it's in 9-inch, then you can go to 9-inch, and then you'll realize that the volatility of what you saw in Pulsex is no longer there, because it tells you what DEX was the one that you should go look at. And then you could see through the DEX screener that it already had all the liquidity. So then you know that that's the one you need to go through, not Pulsex, because of the whitelist thing, right? Same thing with Piteous. And you and I had that talk before about another asset a while back. And it was like, it was, even I need reminders of the things, right, on how those types of things work sometimes.
Well, and I'm going to make it even worse for our listeners, right? Just because it doesn't show up on Dex Screener doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Right. So I have multiple examples of millions of dollars, literally millions of dollars of LP, that because of the aforementioned whitelisting, do not even appear there. But if you go over to something like Dex Tools, you'll see it. Right. So people just need to understand we're kind of this is the Wild West in a way, right? There's lots of stuff going on, and you cannot just assume anything. You need to go look. And I hate that I'm saying that. I know it gives people angst, right? So let's talk about the dexes. The dexes favor sometimes their own stuff in a certain way. All right. So what does that mean? That means because they might be favoring things in a certain way, you might get more favorable deals, right? Example, you see a V2 out there, which allegedly should be the cheapest way to do things, and you already covered this. But you go look on 9mm or over on 9-inch, and the 1% and the 2% pair are getting hit. Why are they getting more volume than the V2, which is supposed to be 4 times cheaper if you're looking at a 1%, and 8 times cheaper if you're looking at a 2%? Again, it comes down to that liquidity. The fact that somebody has the smarts enough to create this targeted liquidity. So you have that. So you got to remember that 9-inch, 9mm. I'm not picking on them. I'm just saying there's lots of opportunity in all this, but there's like this mixed up situation as the software progresses, and then you cannot discount also that one of these things could be broken, right? They're front ends. They're not immutable in all cases, right? well, I don't think front ends can be immutable anyways. So they're relying on information coming in and all the rest. Not all of them are using, doing something in the background to get prices in some sort of immutable way. So you just have to be aware of all this, because particularly if you're getting into the LP thing where you're doing a lot of swapping, you could be losing, 1% here, 1% there, and not even know it.
Yeah, dude, there's some assets where I have like 6 pairs of the same asset all up because they all show different ratios to each other on the price. And because it's across multiple dexes, like for instance, one of them happened to have like a huge price difference between one pair and another, and one of those pairs was in 9-inch, right? And I was like, okay, so how do I go and touch that specific pool without touching any of the rest of them? So I was digging around on 9-inch, and I realized that you can actually, like, they have actually go in here.
Just in the settings, right?
In the settings, you can change it so it actually involves V2 pools or V3 pools, so you can actually go to the one specific pool and then arbitrage that completely. Yeah. And it has no premium. You wouldn't even know anything up. And you're like, my $10 sell just increased the price by 50%, like all of a sudden.
Yeah.